It's about a death row inmate, Shay Bourne, an uneducated, marginal man who's been convicted of a double homicide, who decides that to redeem himself, he must donate his heart post-execution to the sister of his victim, a little girl who needs a heart transplant. Now, we don't have slavery in America, but if you're on death row, the state pretty much owns you. You'd have to petition for a less humane form of execution than lethal injection. Every state that has the death penalty has an alternative method, a firing squad, a gas chamber, or, in New Hampshire, hanging. And if you do that the right way, you could donate your organs. As you can imagine, Shay's request attracts a lot of media attention, which the prison doesn't want. They call in a priest to talk some sense into Shay about what redemption really is, and the priest arrives just as Shay begins performing miracles. The priest can remember one other guy who had a death sentence hanging over his head who was performing miracles, and things didn't work out so well for Jesus in the end either. And so instead of talking to Shay, the priest decides to just listen. But nothing Shay says comes from the Bible. Instead, it comes verbatim from a real ancient gospel that was rejected as heresy by the church and excluded from the Bible. And the priest begins to think, people are always finding God in prison. But what if he was already there? And what if the things he said didn't match what you've been told your whole life, but instead the things you'd been told were wrong? Research for this book was two-pronged. I began by learning about the death penalty. America is the only first-world country that still uses capital punishment. According to polls, 70% of Americans support it, but that number drops to 50% if the choice is between death or life imprisonment without parole. In New Hampshire, where I live, the death penalty is on the books, but hasn't been used since 1939. In fact, the death cell is now used to store extra mattresses, and the site of the old gallows is the chaplain's office. Clearly, I needed to see a working death row, so I scheduled a visit to Arizona to see the facilities and talk to a death row inmate face-to-face. I was halfway across the country on a plane when my visit was canceled. Apparently, they decided I was the wrong kind of media. I found myself banging on the door of the prison. Instead of having trouble getting out, I couldn't manage to get in. Eventually, I sweet-talked my way into a tour of death row. To be honest, if it's working right, it's very boring. Prisoners are locked down for 23 hours a day in individual cells. So I begged to be taken to the execution chamber, which in Arizona is called the death house. They've got a gas chamber and a lethal injection chamber. Both were spotless. I was flicking the microphone switch outside the gas chamber when a woman came up and asked me what I was doing. I told her that I'd been brought down by a correctional officer, and I explained what he'd told me about death row. She folded her arms. "I wish he hadn't told you that," she said. "That's not quite the way it is." "Well, maybe you could talk to me then," I said, since surely she had all the right answers. As it turned out, this was the warden of the prison. I asked her if she'd ever presided over an execution. She had. Then I asked if she'd ever attended an execution that she wasn't running. She looked at me and said, "That's a very personal question." I stared at her. "Uh-huh." Finally, she told me about Deborah Milkey, a woman who told her 4-year-old son that they were going to see Santa. He dressed up in his Halloween costume, and she drove him into the desert, where they were met by the hitmen she'd hired to kill him for insurance money. She was sentenced to death and told the warden that no one in her family spoke to her anymore. She asked the warden to come to her execution for that reason. The warden said yes, not because she thought Milky was innocent, but because she was a Catholic, and someone had to pray for Milky's soul. "You're Catholic?" I said, surprised. "Do you believe in the death penalty?" She hesitated and then said, "I used to." Then she turned to her assistant and instructed him to get a binder off her desk. The man returned with a huge book full of the statutes and procedures used to execute someone in the state of Arizona. This is a legal document that very few people have seen. Most condemned men sue to get a copy, and it's usually denied. The warden began to read it to me aloud. It included instructions for doing run-throughs of the execution and how to time them so that the victim's family and the inmate's family didn't come into contact on the prison grounds. It gave information about how to find a vein for lethal injection in difficult situations, like in between the toes or in the groin. It explained where the doctor was during all this, much more hands-on than the AMA would like you to think, since an execution isn't sanctioned by the American Medical Association. Yet although the doctor's name doesn't go on the death certificate, they check the IVs and monitor the entire procedure. And finally, she told me how an execution is performed. There are 3 officers who serve as the executioners behind a wall, holding hypodermic needles. The IV line that runs into the inmate's vein splits into 3 separate lines, each attached to one of these hypodermic needles. 2 needles have a placebo, the 3rd has the drug used to stop the inmate's heart. So the 3 officers never know which one of their 3 hypodermics actually killed the inmate. The warden comes in and reads the legal document stipulating the death penalty for the inmate. Then she says, "Do you have any last words?" This is the cue for the doctor to administer the sodium pentothal, which is meant to put the inmate to sleep before potassium chloride is injected to stop his heart. Now, most inmates don't have a lot to say. "I'm sorry," or "I love you, Mom," or maybe "Screw you." But when the inmate finishes, the warden says, "May God have mercy on your soul," and this is the cue for the 3 executioners to push down on their hypodermic needles. What this means, basically, is that the amount of time between the administration of the sodium pentothal and the potassium chloride is not usually enough to put the inmate to sleep. And this is why the Supreme Court is debating whether or not lethal injection is cruel and unusual punishment. I was writing so fast and furious as the warden was giving me this information that at one point I spread out on a horizontal surface and then freaked out a little when I realized I was sprawled across the lethal injection table. The warden told me that this was her job and she'd do it, but she didn't believe in its effectiveness anymore. She'd seen feeble old men executed because it took so long for the system to run its course. She's seen hardened criminals return to the street because their murders didn't fit the criteria for death penalty sentencing. In her mind, justice didn't seem very just. In fact, of all the people I met who worked there, not a single one actually advocated the death penalty. That warden retired unexpectedly about a month after my visit. I sort of like to think maybe I had something to do with it. I had to fly back a second time to Arizona to visit a death row inmate, a man named Robert Towery. Robert and I sat down on either side of a plexiglass wall. He was very polite and called me ma'am. He stood up when I walked into the visiting booth. We've kept up a pen-pal relationship where he asks me about my kids or talks to me about the plots of Lost and Grey's Anatomy. He's an accomplished artist who makes his paints from the pigments of shells of Skittles and M&Ms, or from diluting coffee and ink on the pages of magazines. He's taught me how you make a knife in prison or a stinger to heat up your soup. He's a really nice guy, except for the fact that he was convicted in 1991 of armed robbery, during which he told the victim that he was going to sedate him, and instead injected the man with battery acid and killed him. He admits to being high at the time, and he's been drug-free for 10 years now, which brings me to the real issue for the death penalty. Everyone knows it's not right to execute an innocent man, but what about one who's guilty? The death penalty was suspended in 1972, but by 1976 it was back in action. 38 states have capital punishment on their law books. Is it a deterrent? The FBI Uniform Crime Report in 2004 showed that the South had the highest murder rate, even though it accounts for 80% of all executions. Is it cheaper than life in prison? Well, it differs from state to state, but in Texas, for example, it costs 3 times more to execute a man than it does to imprison him for 40 years, mostly due to the judicial appeals process. Is it fair? What seems to matter more than the inmate's race is the victim's race. If a victim is white, there's more likelihood of a capital murder conviction. Plus, only certain murders qualify for capital punishment, suggesting that the legal system thinks some deaths are more awful than others. The best argument I've heard to explain the death penalty comes from another author, Scott Turow. He says it's the adult equivalent of, "I don't want you playing in my sandbox anymore." It's society's way of saying to a person that they will never fit in, will never be like the rest of us. It was this focus on the differences between people, instead of the commonalities, that led to the second branch of research for change of heart, namely, the history of religion. Everyone knows which Gospels made it into the Bible, but very few people realize that there was a history behind that editorial decision. In 1945, two brothers were digging for fertilizer in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, when they found an earthenware jug filled with leather-bound texts. They burned some for firewood, and the rest made their way to scholars, who identified them as the Gnostic Gospels. As it turns out, in the years after Jesus' death, Christianity was a mess. There were tons of groups calling themselves Christian, and all believing different things. The Gnostics were one of those groups. Gnosis means knowledge in Greek. They believed that being Christian was a good start. But to truly reach spiritual enlightenment, you had to find a secret knowledge, the truth that there's a little bit of divinity in all of us, and that the journey to find it is unique for everyone. According to the Gnostic Christians, you didn't need a priest to help you find God because you were already a part of God. Jesus wasn't a savior, just a guide. Religion was deeply personal. You couldn't believe what anyone told you to believe because you had to find your own path to spiritual fulfillment. To that end, you should always be asking questions about faith instead of believing what you were told. They followed multiple Gospels which preached this secret teaching, including one I particularly like, the Gospel of Thomas. It sounds much more like Buddhism or mystical Judaism than a traditional gospel. It's full of riddles and cryptic quotes, such as, "If you bring forth what is within you will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you will destroy you." Well, when I read that, I knew exactly how Shayborn, my character on death row, would interpret it. He'd want to donate his heart. You can imagine how threatening the beliefs of the Gnostic Christians were to the early Christian church, which was trying to unify itself. Irenaeus, the bishop of Lyon, decided he'd had enough and set about standardizing the Christian faith. He picked 4 Gospels that were important to him: Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which all followed a history of Jesus' life, and John, because he'd distantly known the author. He said that all other Gospels were heresy, and thereby made an editorial decision that's lasted 2,000 years. To be honest, if Irenaeus hadn't done this, Christianity would have probably died out in a mess of infighting. And yet, the baby got thrown out with the bathwater. By getting rid of those Gnostic texts, Christians also dismissed the belief that people might reach spiritual enlightenment in a bunch of ways, not just one right way.